catch me howling at the moon. Trying to catch me howling at the moon. Trying to catch me howling at the moon.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. You are obviously watching Mondays Down South, featuring myself, Zach Bakulik. We have Ev and Cy on the line, our normal three. I'll let these guys say hi here before we get into our hot takes, and then we're going to talk some NBA today. There's a lot that's going on with the first round of the playoffs, so we have a lot to discuss. And there's a couple other things going on with different sports, you name it, like the MLB, the UFC. So we got quite a bit to dive into. Cy, Ev, say hello, and we can go ahead and kick this thing off.
Howdy, folks. Welcome back. Looking forward to it. Let's get after it.
Y'all know I love talking sports with you. If you know I'm coming on here during a Jacob deGrom start, I get it once a week, if that, and it's such a joy for me. So clearly, I love you guys very much for me to be doing this in the middle of a deGrom start. Just throwing that out there.
Ooh.
That's right. And transitioning over, I'm not sure if your hot take, Ev, is baseball or not, but you've been very adamant about starting about this segment and leading us off here. So what's your hot take starting us off here?
Well, I'm always fired up, and this one actually goes across basically every major sport. It's like we need to fix the officiating problem across pretty much every major sport. It is an absolute nightmare right now. So mainly what got me fired up is in the NHL. The NHL officiating is a complete joke on so many levels, and so many rules about it are a joke. The one thing watching the playoffs, apparently if you challenge a call and you get it wrong, then you give up a 2-minute penalty, which is ridiculous to me. That's such it's like a ridiculous penalty for that, first of all. And then, there was just some horrible calls in the games I was watching. And then the Canes coach is criticizing officials, so he gets hit with a $25,000 fine or whatever. I was like, why are they such a protected group when they're so terrible at their job? And they're not held accountable at all. Like, I complain about this in baseball. It's like umpires are an absolute atrocity with some of their strike zones, which is, again, watching games this week, some of them have been an absolute joke, just unfathomably bad and inconsistent. And there's no accountability. And the NBA is the same way. The NBA tries, but there's no accountability. You don't see umpires, referees and stuff getting fired or anything. And it's and then you get coaches and players, they criticize them in press or in whatever, in PR, and they get fined for it. It's just a complete joke. In what other profession, when you do such a horrible, when you're so horrible at your job, are you just basically not held accountable at all? It makes no sense to me.
Okay, I'm going to stop Evan here because I know exactly what he's alluding to. And by games, he's talking about the 5 games that were played between the Boston Bruins and the Carolina Hurricanes, because Evan is a big Carolina Hurricanes fan coming down, down there in Raleigh, shout out. But he is complaining about the referees and not the fact that the Canes blew a 2-0 lead? And then, what was it? They gave up 4 unanswered, and then they dropped to 3-1, and then they just lost 2-1 today, so they lost 4-1 in the series. They would have lost.
They would have lost either way, but the game 2 or game 1 situation that the refs concocted that Brendan Moore got fined for was an absolute joke. It's not even that it was a judgment call that they just botched, but it was the way they articulated the rules and executed on the rules, they contradict each other. It was just, I won't get into it, but whatever.
I could probably give a quick aside here. And speaking of Raleigh, I actually just visited Raleigh for those of you guys watching the podcast here. And Ev obviously opened up his doors here. I got to see the apartment. He got to kind of take me around Raleigh. It's an incredible city. Ev, you definitely live in a cool place downtown, right on Glenwood South, and it was a ton of fun hitting some of the breweries and some of the outdoor bars, social distancing. But it was a great city, great time being down there and living up the Monday Down South lifestyle. But Ev, really appreciate the hospitality.
Yeah, man,
however,
always good to have you.
I would have had a perfect weekend if it weren't for something I saw in sports either. I can't tell you this guy's name. I know he plays for the San Diego Padres. But Ev, you brought up earlier before we started the podcast the unwritten rules of baseball to me make no sense.
Not to cut you off, but the man deserves. The man is the best player in baseball right now, so he deserves the respect of his name being put out there, and it's Fernando Tatis Jr.
Fernando Tatis Jr. is sitting there, already had hit a home run in this game, right? So they're crushing the Texas Rangers by, I think, like 4 or 5 runs. In the 7th, he goes yard on like a 2-2 pitch. And I think this was in the 8th or the 9th inning, and the bases were loaded. And the pitcher couldn't find the strike zone, or maybe he was pitching away from him cautiously, because he is the best player in baseball at the size point. So he's sitting there, it's 1-0, 2-0, now it's 3-0. So apparently what you're supposed to do, for people who have my baseball knowledge or less, you're not supposed to swing on a 3-0 pitch, because you're almost banking on the pitcher from a probability standpoint to throw another ball. You're going to drive in another run, and it's still going to be bases loaded with the same scenario for the next batter. This guy, Tatis Jr., swings on a 3-0 pitch, goes yard, hits a grand slam. It's incredible. 2 home run performance. He gets to home plate. There's a bunch of Texas Rangers in the infield that are like murmuring at him, saying things under their breath. And then even the San Diego Padres general manager is speaking, like not even backing him up. He said he had a ton of personality, so he understands why he did that. But he also needs to understand the unwritten rules in baseball and not swing at that pitch. When in any sport would you not celebrate something as amazing as a grand slam, where you're literally bringing in 4 different runs, including your own, and it's not even being celebrated? If anything, it's looked down upon. I think the Texas Rangers need to look more at their bullpen issues as opposed to calling out other players for hitting home runs against them. But that's just my 2 cents. I could be wrong about this, but I think he should not apologize for hitting a grand slam in the 9th.
I'm going to turn this to my hot take as well, because it's just fun enough to talk about, and I'd rather put the attention on it because it's been so big in sports right now. I think that him doing it, there's nothing wrong with. I think back in the day with baseball, when you talk about old school traditional baseball principles, there's these things called unwritten rules. Back then, people would have been more upset. And honestly, I don't blame them, because it was a different game back then. The whole concept of it wasn't just the fact that he swung 3-0. The other problem with it is, back in the day, they used to say if you're up by a huge lead, which at that point they were up 7-0, they would say you shouldn't be swinging 3-0. Like, most people don't swing 3-0 to start off with, because of the concept of you're better off taking a pitch, because if they can't throw 3 balls in the strike zone, then you're most likely going to get walked anyway. But when you're up 7 runs and you swing 3-0, the idea back in the day is what they used to say is that you're trying to lay it on the other team when you've already pretty much got the game won, when it's a late inning and you're up 7-0. There's 2 reasons I have a problem with that. One, we're not in 1980 anymore. We're in 2020. So the game has changed significantly. 2, 7 runs is not a lead that is a guaranteed win anymore these days. Teams have come back from 7 runs more often than not. We're seeing more home runs than ever. The ball flies these days. So you can't just make assumptions about it. And last but not least, if someone does swing at it, that kind of reaction is absurd. Like, why is it to the level that the Rangers reacted? It seems more like frustration on their end with their team, and the fact that they were losing by as much as they were, more so than what Tatis did. And what I love the most about it is there's a lot of unwritten rules. The next day, Tatis Jr. gets on base. They're up 6-0, and he decides to steal second base when they're up 6-0, which is another unwritten rule from back in the day of, if you are up by a big lead towards the end of the game, you should not be stealing when you're up huge, especially if you're up like 4 to 5 runs. And with 6 runs, he steals second base, and it cracks me up. But the one thing I really want to touch on really quickly, though, is the reason he got a lot of flack from his own manager is because his manager gave him the take sign. And he didn't look over at his third base coach and either get the take sign, or he said he didn't look over his third base coach and didn't see the take sign. But in reality, the take sign was out there. And from that perspective, I kind of understand, because if I'm a manager, even if you hit a grand slam, it's like you're up 7-0. If I give you the take sign, I don't want you swinging. So that part I kind of understand, but Texas blowing it up the way that they did and all these people complaining about it, I don't understand that. At least these days, umps are a little bit more aggressive about giving people warnings if they get thrown at. But if this happened 10 years ago, Tatis would be getting balls thrown at his back and all over. So it's a different world of baseball. But I'm happy that it's becoming more fun, even if I am a traditionalist by nature. So that'll wrap up my hot take too, because it kind of checks the box for me. E, you got any comments on that?
No, I completely agree with you guys. I hated the backlash to that. The one counter is about the take thing. It's like, why does that have to make the media though? I'd still agree that like I didn't like the manager and stuff like criticizing it at all, even if he did have a take sign. Like that's not something that needs to make the media. That can stay within the clubhouse. So
I think the reason it did is because it came out that Tatis apologized for it, and the point that they were trying to make is, I believe he wasn't apologizing to the Rangers for hitting on Grand Slam on 3-0. He was apologizing to his manager for swinging his manager's
side,
which is fair because he is a young guy. He's like 22, and when your manager tells you to take, like usually you should be taking, otherwise you get reamed out. So because if it was 3-0 and he swung and he hit a ground ball and they turned a double play or something, then all of a sudden it's really blown out there as to why you're swinging 3-0 in that situation. So yeah.
I also like how Manny Machado always finds a way to get thrown at, even when he doesn't do anything, because that's who they ended up throwing at, because it was the next pitch after, and Manny follows Tatis. So you can actually see it's funny. He's in the on-deck circle when Fernando swung, and he had a reaction like, oh, boy, because he, like, theoretically, he saw him do that, and he was like, oh, man, they're going to be mad, and then they're going to throw at me, and they did. Theoretically, that's what his reaction was, but so I thought that was funny. Yep. But should we carry on?
Sorry, quick shout out to Tatis though, because he's currently leading the league in home runs, RBIs, runs scored, and stolen bases. So he's got every category locked down with the exception of average. That is ridiculous because he is a second-year player in the MLB and is putting up ridiculous numbers. So if we're going to talk about him, I just felt that should be mentioned. But we will move on. I think we can jump over to basketball, right? I mean, playoffs have started. I think
let's do it.
It's fun to be able to talk about something that's actually currently happening, and it's fun to be able to talk about the postseason in any sport, much less the NBA right now, where the bubble has been crazy. There's been so many fun games, so many, nail biters and clutch performances, and just a lot of fun. And right now, we're 3 days in. Right now, the second games of the first group of teams is happening, but we have plenty to touch on with the first 2 days. We had 2 8 seeds winning in the first round. And I don't recall that happening ever that I remember watching basketball. So that was pretty crazy, especially against 2 1 seeds that for a long time looked unbeatable. So in that way, that was pretty fun to start the slate off. Obviously, Lakers Blazers will be one that we definitely discuss. Got the Bucks losing to the Magic with several players out. That was a big one. Houston beating OKC pretty handily without Russell Westbrook. Those are just a couple I can think off the top of my head. What are some reactions you guys have? Is there anything in particular you want to cover first? I'll leave the floor open to you guys.
One thing that caught me by surprise was the Magic defeating the Bucks by double-digit points. I thought that was something that was not maybe talked about enough on ESPN or just through any media outlets. I kind of just quickly glanced in the morning at some of the scores and was definitely caught by surprise because, if you look at the 2 and 3 seeds, right? So the 2 seeds in the East, Toronto, the 3 seed, I believe, is Boston, right? Yep. And then you have the two seed being the Clippers. Like, they're taking care of business, right? Like, they're doing their job. I guess you could argue that the Nuggets and the Jazz, is that the 3-6 matchup? I'm not sure if it's the 3-6 or the 4-5. I know they're kind of in a tight battle at 1-1 right now, but what you should see from these 1, 2, and 3 seeds is like pure dominance over their counterparts, right? If you're playing the 7 and 8 seed, especially in the East, we're talking like teams that have losing records. And the Bucks are, notoriously known for not doing super well in the postseason, always being that glorified team during the regular season that can never do anything. So if they have the opportunity to change things, I think they need to change things sooner rather than later. I would like to see the Bucks come out and, truly display a dominant performance against the Orlando Magic. That's what I think is going to happen too. But one thing I will say is I'm not as confident with the Lakers. And there's a man that's on this podcast that's sitting there with his hat on over there named Sai Kunimnini, who bet me 4-1. I bet him 4-1 odds that the Trailblazers would win in 7. And he thinks that the Lakers are going to win straight up. So he's willing to take that bet. I'm excited. I like where things are playing out with Portland going on a 19-6 run to end the game and ultimately defeat the Lakers. Now, it was definitely a game one performance. There was a lot of sloppy play. I definitely expect the Lakers to bounce back in game two. But honestly, I mean, start your engines because Dame Lillard is firing from all cylinders. He can't even, I mean, he's hitting shots from 10 feet beyond the 3-point line. I mean, pretty much from the logo. So ultimately, it's been a really, really exciting first couple days of postseason basketball. But what do you guys think about everything that's going on?
Well, Zach's already touched on the big two right off the bat. He didn't
he went
to address it. This man just went right into both. All right, fair enough. I'm going to start with one. I think we'll focus on one game first and then go to the other because obviously we'll have plenty to talk about with both of them. The Bucks one, I'm going to start with. The part that cracks me up is, and Zach isn't the only one who reacts this way to it, which is why I'm really glad he said it. He said the Bucks are notorious for going to the playoffs and losing. I don't think that's notorious when it happened for one, maybe 2 seasons with a really young roster and Giannis only really being an MVP level player for a year now. Yes, last year they lost in the playoffs, but they ended up losing and then the Raptors ended up winning the championship. So it's not, crazy to think that they lost last year. Giannis played well, but he was still really young. Yeah, I will completely agree with you that Monday's loss was not a good one. I think we all agree with that. Obviously, that is a game that was very winnable. I still think they're shaking some cobwebs off, quite frankly, and that's not an excuse. I mean, you gotta play to what you're given in this situation. It's just kind of crazy to see where they were before, because before they were beating the Magic like it was nobody's business. They were beating them by 20 to 30 points, even with the full roster for the Magic, and they went out there and really struggled the other day. So I think, and I fully expect the Bucks to bounce back. If anything, I almost feel like this is even a little bit more of a wake-up call for them to figure some things out, as opposed to going into series later on in the playoffs and running into better teams and playing like this. I think maybe this will help them, give them a little kick in the butt, because I really do think Giannis is going to take that next step in the playoffs this year. He's too good not to. And quite frankly, his role players didn't do very well the other day either. And that Bucks roster is deep. Their bench is as good as some teams' starters, at least teams that didn't make the playoffs. So I fully expect them to bounce back. I'm going to hold off on the Lakers because I kind of want to save that for a little bit because I have a lot to say about that one. But I'll let Ev react to the Bucks real quick and the Magic, if you got any takes on that.
Yeah, I think Zach made a good point, though. But and I was talking to our shout-out Kevin Smick, who was on the pod, another NBA expert guest that we had on. I was talking to him about this. It's not as much the sample size with the Bucks, because obviously the playoff sample size, like you said, side with the Bucks is small, but it's Budenholzer from the Hawks days, who similarly were a top seed for several years in the playoffs and never really got it done, never made the finals, anything along those lines. And it's that style of run and gun play that Budenholzer has, which is the same as they do with the Bucks, which for whatever reason doesn't seem to work in the playoffs. I couldn't tell you why. I don't even think most people do, but they had that same problem with the Hawks. So it's not just, I think, the small sample size with the Bucks that concerns people, but also that Budenholzer style from the Hawks days. With that said, I don't think there's a ton of concern with that Bucks loss, just because, again, separate, I'll save the Lakers a little bit, but separate from how that turned out, the Magic just kind of played out of their minds. That's like peak Magic, how they're going to play. And obviously the Bucks didn't play well. So I think it's just more about the Magic playing out of their minds. I think the Bucks will bounce back. And obviously the Blazers are a much better 8 seed than the Magic. So ultimately, I'm not too worried about this series despite that loss. But I do think there's some merit to Budenholzer across both of those teams and that style of play. Maybe something about that style doesn't work in the playoffs. But with that said, and we'll talk just a little later on some of the other matchups, it's I also don't think there's that much of a threat in the East right now. But yeah, that's my overall take on the Bucks.
That's a good point. I want to touch on 2 more matchups before we get to the Lakers, because I think that's the one we're going to have the most talks, because it's probably, in my opinion, the most exciting and the one that's been the most competitive, if you will, in terms of what people think is going to happen. The Rockets Thunder, I think we knocked that out really quickly. The Rockets won big. That game wasn't even close going into the second half. I think the whole team was firing on all cylinders. One thing I'll point to is that they shot over 40% from the 3-point line. And when you take a big lead against the Rockets, flip-flop, when the Rockets take a big lead against you, the last thing you should be doing is trying to match them in triples, because you're not going to beat them at their own game. You're not going to beat them at the D'Antoni system. I watched that game, and that is the main problem I saw with the Thunder. when the Rockets took a lead, instead of them playing their style of basketball, which was attacking the rim and finishing down low, especially with the Rockets running that roster without Capella and having that smaller group, they got away from that once they fell back and were taking a lot of three-pointers. Admittedly, they were open for a lot of those, but at the same time, you're not going to outshoot the Rockets. So the Rockets had a huge statement victory without Russell Westbrook. My personal opinion with that matchup is that it's far from over. I think the Thunder are a really, really solid roster with a lot of depth, a lot of guys that play really good defense, and a lot of guys that just are aggressive and up to the task. I think Chris Paul has a check mark or asterisk on this game or in this series because of the way his tenure ended with the Rockets. I think he wants this really, really badly, and I believe the Thunder have what it takes to bounce back and take advantage. I think they need to get Adams involved more. I think Shai Gilgeous-Alexander will have a better game. Chris Paul had a really bad game. That guy's too good for him to play like that. I think he'll get better. I just think overall that series will be more exciting, even though the Rockets got a big win right off the bat. And lots of credit to them because these are the kinds of games they need to take if they want to stay in the series until Westbrook gets back and, have him rolling going forward. So that's my take on that. What do you guys think?
See, I disagree with that. I think Houston is a scary matchup for OKC. If you can't bring anything explosive or some type of offensive juggernaut to the table, you're really not faring against Houston well because Houston is going to put up a ton of numbers. Harden had 37, and I mean, he was electric. As you had mentioned, Sai, they were over 40% from three. Now, the question is, does that hold? Statistically, you're not firing 40% from three. They're chucking up about 40 or 50 three-pointers. Not many are going in. But I think that this is a really bad matchup for OKC because they don't really bring that explosive vibe. Chris Paul's a great facilitator, but he's averaging like 18 to 20 points a game and some change. I mean, like, he's a great facilitator, but when you don't have anybody explosive like, I don't know, Russell Westbrook on OKC anymore, it's really tough to fight fire with fire. So I think that Houston is going to fare out very, very well. And when Westbrook comes back, I think that team is just going to continue to get more dangerous until they really find some extreme defensive threat like the Clippers or the Lakers. I think Houston is going to have their field day. And I don't think OKC is going to stop them one bit. I have that series going like 5 or 6 games max.
So a couple things right off the bat. One, I'm glad you mentioned Russell Westbrook and how you're saying the OKC Thunder didn't have Russell Westbrook to lead an explosive offense, because if you look at the last couple of years, Russell Westbrook couldn't even get them to the playoffs, much less win in the playoffs without that.
What year did Westbrook not bring the Thunder to the playoffs?
How many times did they go to the playoffs in the last 2 to 3 years? What was it? With Paul George, they made it once. And actually, sorry, they made it twice with Paul George. And
right.
No. When I was saying Russell Westbrook didn't take him to the playoffs, I'm saying without Paul George. Like, keep in mind, Paul George and Russell Westbrook are both off the team. Russell Westbrook, the last season when Paul George wasn't on the Thunder and Westbrook was carrying the team, he averaged a triple-double and didn't make the playoffs. And yet he won MVP, which that's a whole different argument. But I'm just, I still think Harden should have won that. We'll talk about that later. What the point I'm trying to make is the Thunder last year were an 8 seed with Russell Westbrook and Paul George. This year they're a 5 seed without Russell Westbrook and Paul George, and that's not a fluke or something that randomly happened. The reason that happened is because they are a great team defensively. They are a team that plays together. They're not a team that relies on one player to do it all for them. They're a team that when they're winning, they have 5 different guys putting double-digit points up. You got everybody helping with assists. You got everybody playing defense. And also, you mentioned that they aren't a good matchup for Houston. Well, if you look at their season matchup so far, the Thunder have won that matchup so far. I think they're either 3-1 or whatever. All I know is they've won the matchup. And the reason they've won the matchup is because of their defensive prowess. They've managed to shut Harden down as much as you can shut Harden down. I mean, in their series this season, Harden is shooting 15% from the three-point line and shooting 33% from the field over the regular season. I understand the playoffs is a different story, but the point I'm trying to make is a lot of people think you need that explosiveness to beat Houston. All I think you need to do is get a hand up on the perimeter and beat them down low, because at the end of the day, they don't have a down low presence to play defense. They're not going to continue to shoot over 40% from the field. Chris Paul is not going to continue to shoot like 20 or 30%. He's too good for that. And the rest of Thunder, I think, are going to step it up. Sure, I'm not saying that it's crazy to say the Rockets would win the series. There's probably a good chance they will. But all I'm saying is don't be surprised if the Thunder come back and make this a 6-7 game series, and don't be surprised if they win it, because it is not a fluke that the Thunder ended up the 5 seed. And just barely the 5 seed. They almost had a better record than the Rockets. Basically, it came down to I think one game or something like that. So I'm excited to see what the Thunder do personally. I that's one of those teams that's been slept on all season, and I think they're ready to show people. Like, that wasn't a great game one, but I think they'll come out firing next game. We'll move on. Actually, I really wanted to point this out because Ev brought up officiating earlier, and I wanted to save that take specifically for this series because we all know what happened with Kristaps Porzingis and the Mavericks playing the Clippers. Luka Doncic gets hurt early in the game, goes to the locker room, comes back, is having the game of his life in the playoffs to keep them in it. They're going punch for punch with the Clippers, who are considerably the better team, but these guys are playing out of their minds to stay in this game. This is a huge game one because if they take it, you shift momentum and you manage to put the ball in your hands and like put the pressure on the other team. And then Kristaps Porzingis gets hit with the second technical of the game and gets ejected. And admittedly, when I was watching the game or when I first heard he got ejected, I was frustrated at Porzingis because I was like, how can you get yourself ejected when it's such a important game? Like, why are you being dumb enough to get teed up in that situation and taking yourself out of the game? But then I went back and watched the replay, and I completely regretted my take or perspective on it because, quite frankly, that was such a soft call. He got 2 tees. You could argue he should have gotten no technicals, much less 2 of them, especially the second one. There is no grounds for giving him second one and ejecting him there. They completely ruined that entire game by taking him out, killed some momentum. The Mavs did the best to hang in there that they could after that, but it just was too much. I mean, Luka was already having to do so much as it was, and you take out Porzingis, who has been terrific in the bubble. I mean, I would probably have him like second team, all bubble team or whatever they're calling it these days, but he was playing great. You take him out, and all of a sudden, the Clippers win the series. He's back tonight. The game's actually happening right now, so I'm rooting for the Mavs to make this even series. I want to see a really good series here, and I think we can get it if everyone stays healthy. But that was kind of crazy, and I just wanted to like bring that up because Evan brought up officiating earlier. So
yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. I forgot that as my hot take, but that was one of the big ones that inspired it as well. I was like, that's just pathetic. Like, have some awareness on the situation. Like, you can't do that. Like, that
it really
is honestly a joke to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is something that official should be fined for, in my opinion. If you can find other people in the league and stuff like that is like just such a hapless performance of your job. Like like you said, it ruined it. Yeah. And it honestly, in some ways, it ruins the whole series.
It was similar to the Saints pass interference call. It was almost on that level. Like, I'm not going to say that level because that was the NFC Championship, but it was on that level because it's a huge series. Like, the Mavs were playing their butts off. Like, if you win game one, you give yourself a much better chance to win the series, right? And that completely took them out of it. So that was really frustrating. Zach, what do you think?
First of all, I got a question for Ev. Ev, was there a rec sports ref that you just did not like? I mean, man, you are...
I will say last night when we were talking about some of this, I was extremely wound up because there was a real chirpy kickball game that I had. And then we also blew like an 8-run lead in the other end of a doubleheader. So I was especially wound up last night. But
to your point, Si, I think it's a really interesting series, and I understand where both of you are talking about where if Dallas could have knotted this thing at 1-1, it makes it psychologically a completely different series where it actually puts pressure on the Clippers to continue to perform. And I mean, honestly, if Dallas is playing any other team in the top 4 outside of the Clippers, I think that'd be posing even more of a threat just because of the talent that you both have alluded to. I think Doncic and then obviously Kristaps Porzingis are huge talents. And honestly, I think Kristaps, on a previous podcast, we mentioned him as some of the top 5 influential players going into the playoffs this season, right? So, definitely unfortunate. I mean, the technicals, in my opinion, weren't even warranted, especially the second one. So it's definitely frustrating to see that. You obviously want to see your stars continue to stay in the game and compete, but we'll see what happens in Game 3. I mean, even if Dallas can sneak one away, that will be super interesting. It could certainly kind of change the trajectory of the series, but I still think the Clippers have a solid grasp on that. Another team that I think has a very solid grasp on their current standing is the Boston Celtics. I'm not sure if you guys have been watching that series between the Philadelphia 76ers and the Boston Celtics, but the Celtics can't stop scoring, guys. They just put up 128 points earlier today.
Well, they're playing the Sixers.
Yeah, I was just gonna say
without Simmons.
I mean, it's incredible. Jason Tatum and Kemba are
Jaylen Brown are. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are great. I'm not trying to take anything away from them. But the 76ers, without Ben Simmons playing the Boston Celtics, I would hope you would do that because they were never really that great defensively this season anyway. Ever since Jimmy Butler left and Al Horford has been struggling and they paid all that money to him and Tobias Harris and Ben Simmons and Embiid couldn't figure it out and all that, throw all that in there. And then Ben Simmons is out right now. Embiid's doing what he can. Game one was actually closer than I thought it would be. Today, the Sixers had the lead early and then just couldn't stop the Celtics. This is what I expect, though. Like, if you don't have Simmons, the Celtics should be winning. And they lost. I was about to say Jason Tatum. They lost Gordon
Hayward
with the ankle.
They did lose him to an ankle, yeah.
But to be honest, he wasn't like one of the most influential players on that team because they still have their two young guys that are just straight killing it, and they should because who on that team is going to defend him? Ben Simmons would have been a great matchup for one of those two guys, and he's not there. And honestly, the Celtics should win this series easily. If they don't win in 5 games, I'm honestly surprised because it's just teed up for them on a silver platter. So they can get a quick win and get some rest if they need to with this series. I expect nothing less.
Yeah, my quick takes are the same. The Sixers are just a mess. I mean, Brett Brown's going to get fired. Embiid struggles with the double team without Simmons. Just kind of a mess here. So, but Hayward, he wasn't necessarily one of the top key players, but like they're not very deep at all anymore, which is a surprise because usually the Celtics are very deep. But it's like, especially without Hayward, like it really hurts their depth. I think it's going to be hard for them to challenge even the Raptors next round, much less the Bucks. Without Hayward.
Yeah, well, they lost Horford last season. Kemba Walker's obviously a great player, and he's on the roster. And then the other thing is Marcus Smart gets slept on a lot, and I think he needs to be mentioned because he's one of the best role players that you can have on a team that already has a bunch of scorers because he's just going to come out there and bring that intensity every single time and just play lockdown defense and fight for rebounds and be chippy and all that stuff. So he's somebody that I've always had a lot of respect for. There's a couple guys, though. They lost Horford. They actually lost Marcus Morris, who a lot of people don't even pay attention to, but he was a great role player for them, and he's killing it with the Clippers right now. I was saying at the trade deadline when they got him, that was a huge move for the Clippers. So they have lost a lot in terms of role players recently, and Hayward was playing better than he had in the past couple seasons come off that injury. So losing him is going to be big, and they said 4 weeks. So the big thing is, I think this is a series that's very winnable for them. But if they're the 3 seed, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, so they'll get Toronto.
They'll get Toronto and that's the other series I was going to mention. That just seems like a straight wash. I don't see them coming back. Toronto maybe loses 1, but I'd be surprised if that didn't go 5 because Toronto's playing amazing team ball. Pascal Siakam's incredible. Even when their guards are having bad games, like Van Vliet wasn't great today, and they still won. They just have so many different guys contributing. That's another team that I would compare similar to the Thunder, where it's a very team-centric game where no one guy is like you fully rely on. Everybody plays their role, and on any given day, one of them can take over or one of them can make the big shot at the end. That's how the Raptors play ball, and they're coming off that championship, and they're trying to prove to the world that they can do it without Kawhi, and they're doing a good job of it. So,
are there any current matchups here that you see in the next round where there could be potentially an upset? Obviously, we'll get to Portland and LA later, but what do you guys think?
The Pacers are not a team to sleep on. Oladipo went out yesterday because of a poke in the eye, I think, or something like that. So I'm hoping it wasn't serious enough to the point where I think he should. Ev, I don't know if you watched that game or if either of you watched that game. I don't think he was back by the end of that game, right? So I didn't get to watch the end, but I'm hoping that he'll be back next game. I haven't seen a report on that. I'll have to get back to you guys on that. But with Oladipo, that Pacers team isn't like one that should be slept on either because TJ Warren has been one of the best players since the bubble started. Another thing that I love about that matchup is the heat, the literal heat that Jimmy Butler and Warren have towards each other. This happened before the series got underway. This happened during the bubble. There was a lot of trash talk, and I can't fully remember the origin, but basically they were chirping a lot, and I think somebody said something to one of Butler's teammates, and they were just having a whole bunch. So it's really fun watching that matchup because Butler is. I love Jimmy Butler because even though I don't think as a leader he'll ever win a championship, he genuinely is such a great basketball player. And I love the aggressiveness that he brings. My favorite story of all time was him being on the Timberwolves and going into practice with the C team and beating beating the starters with Karl Anthony Towns and Wiggins at the time, and like yelling at the like general manager like aggressively and saying screw you to everybody. Like I love that mentality that he brings, and he is bringing that full force in the playoffs, just attacking people on defense. But that's the Heat's motto. They play a lot like Butler. They are very, very aggressive. They're very in your face. They're very like a defensive heavy, like physical team, and that can wear a team out. So I agree with you that they're very slept on. I think a lot of teams on the East just kind of get slept on because people just assume the East is a bad conference because the West is great. But the East is, at least at the upper end of it, has gotten better compared to the last couple of years where it was really only 2 or 3 teams that you would ever really talk about, sometimes one. So I actually think the Heat could pose a threat. But I don't see them beating the Bucks personally. I just think the Bucks have too much depth. Obviously, that was a bad first game, but they are so deep, man. They put a guy in there and he can score for you. He can play defense for you. He can 3 and D for you. And Giannis is going to be the MVP back to back again, and he's going to be better than he was yesterday. So truly, the only team that I think beats the Bucks potentially is if the Raptors can put together this incredible team dynamic that they keep playing. If the Bucks are like still have their foot off the throttle and the Raptors keep playing like that, I could see them doing it. But again, I just think some of these other teams just don't have the depth. Like Evan was saying, with Hayward out, the Celtics lose their depth. Obviously, the Sixers I don't see advancing. I guess the Heat are the only other team I can think of. So I don't see any upsets there. The Denver Jazz series, though, we didn't talk about that, and that's been a great one before we get to the Lakers one, because the Denver took the first one, even though Donovan Mitchell dropped 57, and Jamal Murray went nuts in the fourth quarter, and they went into overtime, and Denver ended up winning that series, ended up winning that game. And then today the Jazz came out and just couldn't miss. I mean, they couldn't miss. Every single one of their players would shoot and it would go in. Like, I don't know what was going on. Like, sure, the defense wasn't great, but they literally could not miss. So they came back and made a statement and won by over 20 against Denver today. Both of those teams are looking so good top to bottom in terms of what they're capable of. I think either of those teams can go into the next round and beat who they play. I'm not saying it's going to happen, because more likely than not, it's the Clippers, unless the Mavs can come back and win this series. And the Clippers are also a very deep team. But one thing I really want to point to with Denver, though, is they have been already one of the best teams in the NBA and a top 3 seed in the West. The Western Conference is, the better conference. They've been the top 3 seed before Michael Porter Jr. started doing anything of significance. Now Michael Porter Jr. decides to go from a guy that was averaging 6 points a game before the bubble even started to playing all-star level basketball. Like, he's had several games of over 20, 30 double-doubles, just coming out playing like that prospect we always thought of, the super tall dude we saw in the Vegas elevators. If you remember that, Zach, like he is out there just balling again. And you pair that with Jokic, Murray, Millsap, and the depth that they have, and if he keeps doing that and they get through this series, all of a sudden the Nuggets are 4 deep in their starting rotation. So I don't know what to think, man. Both those teams are so good. I know I'm ranting here, but I can't stop. They're so good. I'll let you guys chime in here, but damn.
Well, Sai, I think he needs to give credit to Mondays Down South, because I remember in that elevator in July of 2019, I told him in the elevator, I said, hey, look, there's going to be a pandemic. And after this pandemic, and when the NBA is played in that bubble, you are going to go off. You are going to turn on the Jets like no other, and you're going to debut exactly what everyone saw of you at the University of Missouri. And that's what he's doing right now. But no, honestly, in this matchup, one thing that is super interesting, has been really, really fun to watch, and I think you mentioned it briefly, is Murray versus the point guard for
Mitchell, yep.
My name's, yeah. And I think one of the most interesting matchups is Murray versus Mitchell, because this is not only a Utah Jazz versus a Denver Nuggets thing. This dates all the way back to college basketball, when they played right around the same time at Kentucky and Louisville. And obviously, knowing how powerful basketball is down in that state, it's been very interesting to see their matchup there, and then their matchup translate to the NBA as well. So definitely one thing I wanted to mention on that series. But Ev, what do you think about that series, and what are your thoughts?
No, agreed. Super interesting series. Again, from our prediction special way back when, before the NBA came back, I like the Nuggets a lot, like I mentioned then, but the Jazz also look great. And I think Donovan Mitchell heard a lot of the he's no more than a 6-man buzz, because he's playing really well. So I think that's going to be a really good series. I still like the Nuggets to not only win that one in a very close series, but to also give presumably the Clippers or the Mavs a real run for their money. I think I picked them to go 7 against the Clippers. So, I think it'll be a fun series in the first round. Though.
And a quick note on that: Mike Conley wasn't playing because he took paternity leave because his child was born. So they were missing him. Then they're able to tie the series 1-1 because I'm pretty sure he didn't play today. That's he definitely didn't play game 1. So, and they took him into overtime. So the Jazz are really holding up their end of the bargain, and so excited to see what happens there. With all that being said, let's get to the series we want to talk about probably the most, and what we can talk about the most, I will say, and I think that's the Lakers and the Blazers. I'll let you guys start because I think this is going to be one of those where I'm rebuttaling a lot.
Yeah, I mean, unlike my take on the Bucks, like I genuinely think this is a problem for the Lakers right now. I mean, obviously, I think, and again, not to keep shamelessly plugging our predictions episode, but it was like we talked about it, like that was the Blazers were, I think, a couple of our picks to come out of that spot, and it was like if they do and they get hot in the bubble, like the talent is there where they're not a traditional 8 seed. And obviously the way they're playing right now, and we also mentioned Lillard, who can go kind of hot and cold in terms of his almost his effort for whatever reason. He just kind of can be in and out. Well, he's in right now, obviously, and just playing at an elite level, an MVP level. And obviously with CJ, Melo's a nice addition. They got healthy with Colin, like all those guys. This is a problem for a Lakers team that, again, on the perimeter isn't that strong. Like the guys like Danny Green didn't play well. I guess Waiters and Smith didn't even play for whatever reason. I guess they chose to go Alex Caruso, which makes no sense to me. And obviously, I think the big problem in game 1, which I think Sai will touch on, Anthony Davis not being very efficient. And then my take, which I know Sai completely disagrees with, but and I said this before, I was like, I think LeBron, as amazing as he is as a distributor, a leader, rebounding, ball hand, like all the things, I think he needs to score more on this team. Like, I don't think there's enough scoring around him. Even with Kuzma coming off the bench and even with Ant, like I think he's going to have to score more and have those like 30+ point games if they're going to make a deep run. And this Blazers team, they're a real problem.
From a numbers standpoint, I mean, obviously the Lakers were very inefficient. Pretty much every player across all the boards except for LeBron, because LeBron had an unprecedented night. He was the first player in NBA history to have over 20 points, 15+ assists, 15+ rebounds, I believe. First person to do that, and I think that was just in a regular season, or in any potential or any NBA game, regardless of regular playoffs. So that was super interesting. But I mean, obviously, you expect the Lakers to bounce back, and the Lakers played it close even after playing like garbage. And Portland clearly played like garbage too. There were many, many times where they didn't even swing the ball. Like the Lakers actually look like a methodical offense. They're setting up a ton of plays. Vogel's obviously known as one of the best coaches in the game. They're still running like screens, pick and rolls. They're setting each other up for good shots. It wasn't their night. They just weren't hitting. Whereas on the other side of the ball, you just see kind of like an unorganized firework display where Damian Lillard had 23 points and 1 assist at that point in time, which is, great stats, but it kind of is alluded to his play recently. Now, it's super impressive, and it's a reason why I was willing to take that gamble, because as Evan would know, with the way he puts together his March Madness analysis every year, trying to predict the first round, you can get as good as algorithms as you want, but one thing you cannot predict is momentum, and that's something that the Portland Trailblazers have more so than any other team. So I'm pulling for Portland. We'll see what happens in Game 2. It's going to be very decisive. But you would expect as a sports fan and just through standard deviation for the Lakers to bounce back hard because, by the way, they have someone named LeBron James on their team. But, Sai, what do you think?
Okay, so first and foremost, I want to start with the Blazers because I'm not trying to take anything away from them. Honestly, some part of me just feels bad for the Lakers. Not genuinely bad because they still have to win the series and it's on them. But, what is your luck that you get this team as the 8 seed playing against you? Because if you think about it, even though they're the 8 seed, how many teams in the West how many teams would you want to play in front of the Blazers? Probably a couple in that playoff seeding with the way the Blazers are coming in and how hot they are. They definitely have the momentum on their side. Last night, a couple things I want to point to. First of all, Damian Lillard, for what he's done to get the Blazers to where they are, and the fact that they won last night deserves so much credit. I fully understand and agree with him being the bubble MVP. But last night, I don't want him to get all the credit for the Blazers win because people keep talking about just Dame. And quite frankly, Dame didn't have some amazing game. There was a point in the game when, in the second quarter, with 4 minutes left, he scored points. And up until the 7-minute point in the fourth quarter, Dame did not score another point. And yes, he hit that crazy 13-foot behind the three-point line three-pointer, which was amazing, and it was very clutch. But I'm not going to just sit here and be like, oh, Damian Lillard carried them last night, because quite frankly, CJ McCollum had a pretty similar game to Dame in terms of his production. You got good production down low. Just overall, like it was a team effort, not just a Dame effort. Melo had a clutch three. Trent had a clutch three. So it was a team effort. But the point that I'm trying to make here is two things I want to point to. Defensively, the Lakers played a really solid game, because even with these guys playing it the way they were, and the Blazers were scoring as much as they were coming into this game, the Lakers actually played really well defensively. But the part that gets me the most is, Evan and I were talking yesterday, and we were talking about how when LeBron is playing this way, him not being very aggressive is what Evan was saying was the problem with the Lakers losing. And that is the part I disagree with personally, because yes, I do agree LeBron can be more aggressive, and yes, that might pay dividends. But last night, as I was watching that game, the way he plays the game and the way he was trying to play the game last night is he realizes this is a team that isn't clicking all together, right? But how can he just do that? How is it that you put the pressure on him every single game to score 30 or more? You're not going to win your future series if you approach it that way from game one, because when you play future series, if you can get through this one, you got the Clippers, you got the Nuggets, you got these other teams where you can't just win with LeBron going out and putting up 30. He needs his role players to make shots. Although I agree that the players around him are generally not that much better, with the exception of AD and with the exception of Danny Green, last night was an anomaly compared to usually how they are in terms of scoring, all right? AD was 8 for 24 from the field. He shot 33% last night. Anthony Davis shot 33% last night. We're talking about a career over 50% scorer, averaging over 26 points a game this season. AD's not going to do that again. Last night I watched the game, it was a lot of tough putbacks and stuff. He just honestly was cold. He had 21 points in the first half, finished with 28. So he scored 7 points in the entire second half. AD's not going to do that again, all right? The other thing I want to point to, Danny Green was 4 for 12. I understand Danny Green isn't some superstar, but Danny Green is better than 4 for 12 on most nights. He was really cold from the three-point line, but he played great defense. The big thing that I want to put on Frank Vogel right now is, why are Alex Caruso and KCP each playing 29 minutes a game? I understand J.R. Smith and Dion Waiters are rusty. I'm not asking you to give them 20 minutes each, but give them a little bit more time. When Alex Caruso and KCP combined yesterday were 1 for 15. 1 for 15. Think about that. They shot under 10% combined. 1 for 15. Now, I understand I don't expect them to, combine shoot 50%, but there is no way they come out again and shoot 1 from 15 on that end. That is a complete anomaly. And the other stat I want to point to last night was the Lakers were 2 for 12 from three-pointers where it was at least 6 feet distance. So the reason I'm stating that is these are wide open three-point shots. They were 2 for 12. I understand they're not traditionally a great three-point shooting team, but they're better than 2 for 12 overall. I think overall a lot of things broke badly for the Lakers outside of LeBron's performance. And yet, in the fourth quarter, with 2 to 3 minutes left, it was still very much a game. As a matter of fact, the Lakers were up 6 at one point, and you had a super clutch 3 from Melo, a super clutch 3 from Dame, and a super clutch 3 from Trent, all back to back to back. The odds of that continuously happening aren't very high. I think the Lakers pick up the production as we go along in this series. And LeBron, Evan, whether you agree with it or not, if AD played a little bit better last night, even if he shot 40 to 45% and Green hit one more shot, LeBron could have played exactly the way that he did, still had Caruso and KCP be as awful as they were, and still win that game. So I'm not mad at LeBron for getting his teammates involved, because the only way you win championships is to get your teammates involved. If you go in there and you just try to be the superstar and just dominate the series and you don't get the other guys involved, they'll never get hot. They'll never start contributing. And then when you play the deeper teams that are better and you can't beat by yourself, you're going to lose. And if somebody knows that, it's LeBron James, because he's been to the finals more than most people have been alive. So let's just point that out there before we jump the gun on LeBron.
Yeah, my only refute, and I want to save some time to touch on some other topics outside of NBA, but it's like you guys mentioned it. The Blazers also didn't play that well, and they still won that game. And then two, as much as I agree with you, Cy, that a lot of those things broke in a way that we don't expect it to happen the whole series, that's still a lot of question marks on the Lakers side that I would have expected them to figure out before the playoffs started, i.e., who are we going to play as our couple guys off the bench? How aggressive does LeBron need to be? Like those types of things that all of a sudden you don't have any time to figure that out. You need to figure it out, now because the Blazers are serious.
But I think one thing that separates the Lakers from a lot of the other teams, certainly Portland, is in periods of struggle and like a scoring drought, the Lakers can go back to their foundation, which is penetrate, drive, penetrate, dish it to AD, LeBron with a powerful drive, quick score, like right inside the paint. And they can kind of claw their way back in the game. And they've showed that yesterday, which is why they clawed their way back to a lead. Whereas Portland kind of throws up prayers, and albeit they're going in because they have great shooters, but it's just an inevitable period of time where that's not going to happen, and they don't really have any foundational scorer outside of Dame. And so what you're seeing these teams do is they're trapping Dame right when he crosses midcourt, and he's forced to get the ball out. So if some of the supporting cast on Portland can't score, cough, cough, Melo, I'm pointing at you. Every single time he shoots the basketball, I cringe. I don't know if this is a very trustworthy team. And also, I think Portland got really lucky yesterday because they had like 3 or 4 players in foul trouble, like 5 fouls. So we're talking starters. And so I think, they lucked out by the game not going into overtime or, God forbid, something else happened. But that's kind of my point on the Blazers-Lakers point. I know, Ev, you want to talk some UFC before we close this out. UFC 252 featuring Stipe and DC happened last Saturday. It was an awesome fight. I'm not sure if you wanted to touch on that fight or not, but ultimately Stipe won I believe a unanimous decision. There was no knockout this time like the first 2 fights. But Ev, were you able to watch it? And what are your thoughts right now?
I wasn't able to watch it. Seemed like it was a good decision for Stipe. I expected him to win despite the odds. Obviously, I think that's it for DC, even though he kind of goes out on a sour note with the whole eye poke and whatnot. But yeah, I'm just excited to see Stipe and Francis, which I guess my only question was, I think Francis is certainly next. So I'm just excited to see what happens there. But
yeah, and I disagree. I don't think DC is out. There's no way you go out on getting robbed in such a big fight because of an eye poke. Like, he legitimately couldn't see. Like, in the post-game interviews, like, his eye was just it looked like a lazy eye. I was going in all different directions, and so he definitely needs to get that checked out and fixed ASAP. But knowing DC's legacy, I can't see him ending his career on something where there's no spectacle, right? So there's no fans in the audience to kind of, like, send them off with like a big final wave. There was nobody there. And so I think in the next coming years, I mean, honestly, DC's now just fighting championship fights. So I can see him taking like 6 to 8 months off. Maybe at that point in time, you get a crowd back in an octagon. He gets his final send off. But what I do like is John Jones, who has now vacated the light heavyweight title. He's now going to go full weight. He's going heavyweight 100%, and this could be a nice little interesting matchup between DC, John, Stipe, and Francis to hold that heavyweight belt. So that's something that's super interesting, and it will be interesting to see Dana White get back to his promoter days and try to structure something that will kind of benefit all 4 of them.
Yeah, I don't see them doing DC John Jones. Again, that's my thing. It's like I don't see any fight for DC really. And I agree with you. It's a tough way to go out, but I just don't see, like, there's not a title shot in his future because Dana's been very clear. Francis is next. Then John Jones probably gets an immediate title shot. I think John Jones just sits on the sidelines until Stipe and Francis fight, and then John Jones fights the winner. Like, I don't think he fights before then, so he doesn't. And then I just don't see anything for DC that would come up. And I don't think he would want to fight like a Derek Lewis or a Curtis Blades, or I just don't think that's big enough. So, but the eye put, like, it's a tough way to go out. So I don't blame you with that and getting a crowd. But But yeah, moving on from that, we're probably at time. My only quick hits on baseball. Baseball's been awesome, fun to watch, a lot of fun. Ramon Laureano is awesome. This was a couple weeks ago now. We just haven't recorded since then. But him trying to take on Alex Sintrod and the entire Astros team, so here for that, man. That was awesome.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear that because I know it wasn't recent, but that was hysterical. For the fans that didn't know, he got into a scuffle walking down the first baseline because he got hit by the Astros for some. The fact that Astros are intentionally hitting people right now just absolutely cracks me up because more than anything, they're the team that would be getting hit more than anybody if the commissioner in the league wasn't protecting them. And they hit him, and he's walking down the line, and the manager of the Astros, one of the managers of the Astros, like one of the guys on the
hitting coach or something, yeah.
Yeah, like hitting coach said something about his mother or something like that is what they said. And Laureano was by himself. He did not care. He ran at the dugout by himself and was about to fight like 30 Astros by himself. And it was basically like he was doing it for the rest of the MLB and like all the fans that are pissed off at the Astros. And it was just so fun to watch. Like, seriously, shout out to him. That's awesome.
And that coward hitting coach that had his bench Astro player Goonies step in front like they're the Secret Service protecting the president or something so that Laureano couldn't get there. Honestly, the best part about that, like you mentioned, because I actually don't think they were throwing at him on purpose. This was like one of the greatest chirps I've ever seen where Laureano gets hit by a slider and he starts like showing the pitcher like how to throw a slider. He's like, no, you need to whip it so it breaks and doesn't hit me in the back. It was the ultimate chirp. I was like, you are the man.
Oh, I forgot that.
It was awesome.
In my head. You're right. That was one of the funniest things. Because like on a normal game, you would get really mad at somebody for doing that. You'd be like, what the hell are you doing? But against the Astros, it's like I said, it's a blessing. Yeah. To be able to do things like that. So yeah, that's a great last note, Evan. Nice way to sum it up. With that being said, we can sign off here. We got to go watch the Clippers. I got to finish my Mets game. Like, we got plenty of sports right now, so it's exciting to know that once this is done, we get to keep watching sports and keep talking about it. One thing I will say is I'm super excited about next week's segment, bringing you a live fantasy football draft for the three of us are going to get a random pick and pick it. And we have our official league fantasy draft this Saturday. So you'll be getting a lot more fantasy football talk from us going forward because once that season starts, you can't get us to shut up about that. So with that being said, thank you, everybody. As always, this was Mondays Down South. It's been a pleasure.
Try to catch me howling at the moon.